it also includes the right to exclude others from importing or selling products in the country that you have a patent in. So the US or other companies in the US can sue to stop products, Taiwanese products, from even entering the United States. And they can stop them until a trial is finished. So until the verdict comes out. So this can be 2-3 years that your goods are stopped at the border and that you have no chance to pull them in. So this creates a huge amount of power for the country where the goods are supposed to go. And the fact that you can control importing actually introduces an aspect of extraterritoriality to that. So then just as kind of a side note, I think one of the things that the importance of the consumer market has in this is that it really tells us something that's going to be happening with China. So Taiwan and China already have a very complex relationship with labor issues, with factories moving to China, with China being the main supply of raw materials for a lot of things that Taiwanese factories that are still in Taiwan create. And to add another layer is going to be the fact that Chinese patent law is going to become very important for Taiwanese companies as China becomes a main consumer market. So then the fourth reason, and I think this might be a little bit more obvious, is that given the market, given the fact that the US is a primary market, it matters to Taiwanese companies that damages, the risk of monetary damages, how much money you'd have to pay out if you lose, is so high in the United States. So everybody is very interested in any little thing that happens in the US that might change those damages in some way. So in order to get a better understanding of what patents are in Taiwan, we have to start with Taiwanese companies' positions in a global production system, particularly the political and economic relationship between China, Taiwan, and the United States. Over the past 3 decades or so, Taiwan has shifted from labor-intensive industries like textiles into capital-intensive industries like semiconductors, or bandaoti. So this shift parallels Taiwanese companies' decisions to move their labor-intensive segments, so textiles for instance, overseas to Southeast Asia or to China, or to import laborers from those countries to Taiwan. Over the past decade, a similar shift has begun also with capital-intensive industries, with a lot of bandaoti gongsi moving their lower-end technology factories to China as well. So those factories that are built with earlier technology have often already moved to mainland China, and the pressure is building on the Taiwanese government to permit, because currently it's Taiwanese restrictions that are permitting, or that are restricting the current cutting-edge bandaoti processes from moving to China as well. And there's pressure, growing pressure to change that. It's actually already changed a little bit. So the government and several larger Taiwanese companies like Acer and Asus, for example, are attempting to shift from 制造零件, which is to produce the internal parts of a company that has their own brand. And Taiwanese companies produce the internal parts, to 发展品牌, make their own brand, to be their own brand and export their products on their own. So furthermore, there's a larger attempt then to shift away from Daigong, or OEM or ODM is the terms in the industry, manufacturing, in order to produce your Taiwan company's own alternative technologies that can then be controlled in-house. So this shift from Daigong to having your own brand or your own IP is easier said than done. When it comes to intellectual property, companies in Taiwan in many industries find themselves in a somewhat paradoxical position. On the one hand, they want to get around IP rules that prevent them from competing directly with the American, Japanese, and European companies at the top. On the other, though, they find themselves depending more and more on these same IP rules in order to preserve their own small advantage over well-funded, low-labor enterprises in China. So again, on the one hand, they depend on IP owners in Japan and Europe as their main clients. And yet, on the other hand, they want to increase their profits in order to develop their own IP and become their own current clients' later competitors. So how can this shift be done? And what do I mean by alternative technologies? So a good example of this is Shanzaiki. This has been a recent craze in mainland China and also Taiwan, for Shanzhaiji. And the Shanzhaiji are, for those of you who don't know, are cell phones with that have all the necessary basic functions of mobile phones. But they also have plastic bodies that look exactly like iPhones or other expensive phones. But they're sold for considerably less. So Shanzhaiji are actually made possible by a chip designed by a Taiwanese chip company. And they're licensed, the technology for making this chip is licensed to companies in China. So the core technology for this chip was actually developed in Europe, and it's patented in Europe. But what the Taiwanese company has been successful in doing is using the core technology that they have a license and they have to pay royalties for, and then building around it, adding new functions in that create a system. And that system, the core technology is still owned by a European country, but that system is actually owned by the Taiwanese company. So as a result of this, the result of this actually has been a single, very, very simple chip, microchip, that has camera, MP3 playing, video streaming, and normal phone calling functions all in one. The company's Chinese customers therefore need only buy a single chip that also therefore takes up very little space in order to produce and run fully featured phones. So the company's customers in China really only have to concentrate on the outside plastic packaging that makes it look like an iPhone or makes it look like an Android phone or any other Motorola phone as well. So I think this case really helps us to see how intellectual property helps to structure industries into alliances. So the European country still provides the core technology that's producing Shanzhaiji, but it's the Taiwanese company that's produced the system that actually enables the final product to be competitive. At the same time, it also illustrates how Taiwanese companies among themselves and Chinese companies among themselves are actually in competition. And they're often producing for different sets of international alliances or international clients. So for this particular Taiwanese company, in producing basically what we would call a knockoff phone, the company ends up straddling a divide between innovation and imitation, between producing their own thing and depending on the European company. And I think this really illustrates how Taiwan's position is somewhat precarious and paradoxical when it comes to IP. So there are two other ways that Taiwanese companies are attempting to deal with this middle position. So the first is that the Taiwanese government is trying to promote knowledge-intensive industries by encouraging R&D spending, buying up and licensing out patents in key industries. So Gongyan is actually ITRI, is the Institute for Technological and Research Industry. Not really sure. ITRI, I-T-R-I is the English, and it's Gongyan in Chinese. They've been working on R&D in specific areas, in specific target areas, and the idea is to then be able to license that out or transfer that technology into the private sector. And this whole transfer thing really has a lot to do with questions of patents value that I'm going to return to later. So the second way that Taiwanese companies are dealing with this middle position is by trying to build up what they call defensive patent portfolios. So a defensive patent portfolio is basically a way, I hope you can see that, it's basically a way to prevent attacks. So this is from 2005 from the LED magazine, and this is actually fairly similar to the situation in the LED industry today. So there are 5 main companies: Nichia, Osram, Cree, Toyota Gosai, and Philips Lumileds. And these 5 companies basically own the vast majority of the intellectual property in the industry. And very early on, they had almost a war to the death over lawsuits. And the result was that basically all 5 of these companies cross-license their patents. So they won't sue each other. But they do sue anybody new who comes in. And so what you end up having is, you can see there are certain groups that are aligned with other groups.